Welcome, everyone. Welcome as you are starting to filter in. If you can see and hear me, please drop your name and location into the chat, and I will be dropping some special links for you there. See Sacramento, LA, Idaho, Canada, Glasgow, Germany, Maryland, Maine, Ontario, New York, Texas. We have people coming from all over. We absolutely love to see that. All right, I'm going to drop those links again as everybody starts to filter in. Welcome, welcome. We have just a couple housekeeping items to go over before we begin today. But hello, I am Michelle from Pro Writing Aid. Welcome to Science Fiction Writers Week. We're so glad to have you, as always. So first off, in our housekeeping items, replays. You will access these on the hub page, and they will be available for everyone to view until September 28th. After that, they will be moved to the Pro Writing Academy platform. So if you would like to rewatch anything or catch anything you missed, you can find all of those at the hub. Please give us a little bit of time to upload those, as we are at the mercy of the Zoom recordings processing. So you can see all of today's sessions by tomorrow morning. So you can check there tomorrow for the previous day's replays. And we also have an offer for you today if you're interested in upgrading to Pro Writing Aid Premium. This week, all participants have the offer to upgrade for 40% off for a yearly premium plan. That offer is available until September 28th as well, and all of the information for that is on the hub. So if you are thinking about upgrading, now is a great time to do so. And if you'd like to keep the science fiction writing conversation going, we'd love to have you in our private online community. Joining is super easy. You simply visit the link that's in the chat now and also on the slide here, and you just log in with your Pro Writing Aid account, and then you can hop on over to the live event chat to talk to other attendees. So just a couple reminders for today's session. If you have a question for our speakers, please use the Q&A box so that we can keep track of those questions. You can find that button in the center of your Zoom screen. If you'd like to chat with other viewers, please use the chat and be sure to select everyone. Otherwise, your messages will just come to the hosts. So if you want everybody to see your messages, be sure to select that option. And as you can see, the chat moves very quickly. So remember to put your specific questions for the speakers into the Q&A only. So with that being said, thank you again for coming, and we are ready to begin. We are joined today by Anne Hawley and Rochelle Ramirez from Pages and Platforms. Rochelle Ramirez is a certified developmental editor who helps fiction and nonfiction writers structure and finish their projects. She is a co-creator of the StoryPath course and numerous writing masterclasses. She is a co-host of the Happily Ever Author Club at Pages and Platforms and author of the forthcoming book, The ADHD Writer: From Frustrated to Focused to Finished. Anne Hawley is a certified developmental editor of literary, historical, and fantasy fiction, and is the author of Restraint, a novel of forbidden love in Regency, England. She was the producer and writer of the popular StoryGrid Roundtable podcast and currently teaches and develops writing courses at Pages and Platforms. Welcome, Anne and Rochelle. We're so glad to have you here.
Well, we're delighted to be here. Thank you. Give me just a second to get set up and we'll go ahead and get started.
All right, I'm going to hand things over to you, and I will just be here watching with everyone else.
Thank you. Okay, Rochelle, you let me know if the screen looks right to you?
Looks good.
Okay. I just need to get rid of this floating controls. There we go. All right, let's get started here. Oops, I forgot to turn off my video. I do want to turn off my video. Sorry. Don't like seeing myself while I'm working here. One moment, please. Stop video. There it is. Okay. And Okay, thank you for your patience while I fiddle around here. Well, welcome everybody. We have a very large group here today. We love doing presentations for Pro Writing Aid. We are so happy to have you here for the essentials of writing science fiction from Pages and Platforms and the Happily Ever Author Club. Before we get started, we've got a gift for this great science fiction writing audience. It is our guide to the 7 essential story types. You can get that at pagesandplatforms.com/sci-fi. And we'll be talking more about them as we go along here today, those 7 story types. So what brings you here today? Are you stuck in the process of finishing your science fiction story? Have you completed a draft, but you can't quite figure out how to fix problems with it, or even how to define the problems that you sense? Have you gotten down the research rabbit hole? I do that a lot. Have you tried plotting according to one of the many methods out there? Or are you more of a pantser? For those who don't know what a pantser is, flying by the seat of your pants, just writing as you go? Or are you otherwise feeling stuck somewhere along the path to a finished manuscript? We know the feeling, as we have just heard from Michelle. I'm Ann Hawley, and here with me is Rochelle Ramirez. We developed the concepts in this webinar to help you get unstuck. But first, a caveat. We can't emphasize this enough, that everything we're going to show you in this presentation today is a set of tools, not rules. These are some principles of what makes a good working story. Our clients find them useful, and so do we in our own writing, but please don't let any of our ideas today shut down your creativity as a writer. Take what you need and leave the rest. The important thing is first to write the story that's in your heart to tell. Today, we're going to show you some ways to build, evaluate, and improve your science fiction story using 4 tools. Marketing category and setting, also known as genre, essential story elements, story types, and world building. By the end of this webinar, you should have a much clearer idea of how to evoke empathy for your characters, create tension and excitement, provide emotional satisfaction for your reader, convey a thoughtful takeaway, and meet the reader's overall expectations for your story type, so that they're going to be happy to recommend your book and eager to read the next thing you write. That's always a high aim of ours. To approach these lofty goals, we need to start with a fundamental idea. Science fiction isn't a story type. Science fiction is a story environment. It's a setting, and it is a marketing category. In other words, it's a genre. The difference between genre, that is your marketing category and setting, and story type is the key piece of information we hope you will take away today. As your story's setting or environment, the term science fiction generally refers to stories that require readers to suspend belief to a significant degree, more or less, that may have a cautionary premise referring to current times as to an imagined future. They're stories that are likely to involve predicted or speculative technology that may take place on other planets, in this world, or alternate versions of this world, or in space, and are generally regarded as speculative or imaginative, and may veer from accepted scientific understanding in the real world today. Now, at writers' conventions and book fairs, which we are going to get back to doing this year, I think we really are, we always ask people what they're writing. Now, most writers who are writing in the science fiction genre will say so, and then add something, a qualifier like YA or LGBTQ or dystopian or hard science fiction or space opera, etc. Now, these categories tend to describe the specific kind of world the story takes place in, or else the age or orientation or demographic, basically, of the intended reader. And these subcategories might make or break a potential reader's decision whether or not to read your book. Many readers are looking specifically for, say, hard science fiction or dystopian stories, and you as the author need to be clear on what you're offering. Each of these subcategories has its own trends and conventions and rules, and you do need to keep track of them. But Your science fiction genre and its subgenres alone can't tell you much of what you need to know as a writer to build and finish your story. That's what story type is for, and Rochelle will be covering that in depth in just a moment. No matter what science fiction category or subgenre you're writing in, your story structure has to work the same way as if it were set in modern-day Los Angeles. This means that a science fiction story will need to meet certain criteria that most good working stories have in common, regardless of their genre. And that brings us to our second major topic, the essential story elements. The story elements that need to be in place before you really have a professional working draft. And there's another little caveat here. Writing a novel or other book-length work, I'm sure everyone in the room knows this, but I'm going to say it anyway. It is not a one draft process. Sorry about that. The movie image of the writer typing pages, rolling sheets of paper into a typewriter, remember that? And stacking them up, they rip them out of the roller and stack them up and type the end and then send this whole thing off to the publisher. Total myth, big lie. First, you need a zero draft. This is where you metaphorically back the truck up to the construction site, beep, 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 and unload all the building materials. This is the everything draft, the vomit draft, the messy draft, however you want to think about it. Shitty first draft, people call it, where you pour out all your ideas, character sketches, backstories, redundant scenes, story, bunny trails, the whole thing. Whether you outline first or just start writing, that is, whether you're a plotter or a pantser, your initial draft will need work before it becomes a professional working draft. So let's define that professional working draft. To count as a professional draft, your story should have a protagonist with a singular, clear desire. That desire establishes something the protagonist wants to gain and something they fear to lose. In other words, there is something at stake. Pursuing their desire and facing those stakes causes the protagonist to change. The story has a clear premise that's reflected in every scene, and it is driving toward the emotion that the reader for your story type expects to feel. So, desire, stakes, change, premise, and emotion. When these 5 elements are clear and your story is working, then you begin revisions. And then you're on your way to a fully finished and polished story. Nail these elements and you will attract the reader who is just waiting to choose your story. Now, I'm going to pass this discussion to Rochelle. She is literally one of the world's foremost experts on story types. She helped create numerous masterclasses on the subject for the Happily Ever Author Club, and she's here to share a whole bunch of what she has learned. So I'm going to pass this over to Rochelle.
Thanks, Anne. I'm excited to cover this section today because choosing your story type is the single most critical decision you'll make in writing your science fiction story. Story types give you the practical and applicable assistance you need for creating a working draft. That's because your story type determines those important story elements that Anne just went over. Your story type defines your protagonist's motivation, also known as their desire or their want and need. It defines what kinds of things are at stake, what your protagonist has to gain and lose. Story type tells you the specific kind of change arc your protagonist undergoes from beginning to end of the story. And it specifies the kinds of emotions you should aim to evoke in your reader. Story type contains a basic premise or message, which is the idea you want the reader to take away. Don't worry, you'll meet all of these elements again in a moment. All of these essential elements shape your story and inform the story events. That's because story types are a way to understand and communicate the kind of story you're telling. As Anne mentioned a few minutes ago, story type isn't analogous to marketing categories or genres that are used by publishers to communicate with potential buyers. Story types are not explicit in back cover blurbs. Agents and readers don't use these in their decision or whether or not to read your book. Story types are for writers and editors who use them for crafting cohesive stories. As we see it at Pages and Platforms, there are 7 essential story types. Now, other writers and editors have identified more, but we've distilled it down to 7 for the sake of simplicity and ease of use. They are 7 distinct plot forms, each with individual character motivations, stakes, reader emotions, premises, and more. You and your editor can use story types to identify and fix deep structural issues in your manuscript. And knowing your story type will help you both understand, discuss, and improve the kind of story you're telling. Story types are the key to organizing, integrating, and evaluating those essential story elements we just went over. So what are these 7 story types? Here's a quick overview, and then we're going to look at each one of these individually. The 7 story types are action, crime, horror, love, worldview, validation, and redemption. Let's look at them one by one. Watch for those essential elements as we go along. The first story type is action. Action stories are as old as humankind. They teach us the importance of individual heroism in the face of danger. Identifying an action story is pretty easy for most of us. Action stories are plot-driven and involve escape, chase, adventure, rescue, or rebellion. The action protagonist is motivated by the desire to save lives or avoid danger. So action stories involve the high stakes of life and death, or at least safety and danger. The action protagonist usually begins in ordinary life, moves through high stakes danger, and ends as a hero to other people after having restored safety. If you're writing an action story, the reader you're writing for likely wants to feel excitement. They want to imagine their own bravery in the face of danger, and it's your job to deliver those feelings. Before we look at action's essential premise, we should first define what a premise is. A premise, sometimes called a controlling idea or a theme, is a single-sentence statement that describes the value change of the entire story at the climax and identifies the cause of that change. It names the primary story event, what happens, and why. Now, keep in mind that the premise statement you'll hear for each story type is broad and general, and that you'll need to personalize it to your story. For action, the general essential premise is that heroic action leads to saving lives, whereas villainous behavior leads to loss of life. Now, this could end negatively as well when the protagonist fails or dies or is shamed if they failed to act to save the victim. We see the primary story event as reacting to villainous behavior. We see the big story change at the climax, saving lives or possibly loss of lives, and we see the cause of that change, which is heroic action or failure to act. Action stories in science fiction realms are not hard to find. Most popular science fiction films, including superhero and comic book movies, are primarily centered on a hero motivated to save lives. In novels, the subject matter can run a little deeper and turn more philosophical, but there's plenty of action to choose from. Some examples: Andy Weir's mega hit, The Martian, is set in a realistic near future and leverages current science to pit a stranded astronaut against the antagonistic Mars landscape. He takes heroic and desperate measures to stay alive, that is, to save himself as both hero and victim until rescue can come. Parable of the Sower by Octavia Butler begins with the seed of an idea for a new religion, but quickly turns into an action story of chase and adventure as the protagonist leads a group of followers away from roving bands of violent addicts through fire and an earthquake to a promised land. While this novel of ideas has a strong character-driven coming-of-age plot for its young protagonist, her leadership role in facing danger makes action its main plot. Ridley Walker by Russell Hoban is set roughly 2,000 years after a nuclear war devastated civilization. Ridley, the young narrator, has a chosen one arc of adventure across the harsh and toxic landscape, facing deadly packs of wild dogs, rough tribal communities, and nefarious government agents, as he slowly uncovers efforts to recreate the weapon that destroyed the ancient world in the first place. The second story type is crime. We enjoy reading, watching, and writing crime stories because they show us that social order and justice depend on clever people who can outsmart chaotic wrongdoers by using brains rather than brawn. Crime stories, like action stories, are plot-driven. They involve solving a puzzle, investigating a crime, or planning a heist. The crime protagonist is motivated by a desire to solve a puzzle, restore social order, or bring a wrongdoer to justice. And that means what's at stake in a crime story is justice and order. If the protagonist doesn't win, injustice and chaos will prevail. The crime protagonist generally starts out facing chaos, disorder, a crime, and a big question. They end in a more ordered state with a solution to the puzzle, justice, and restored order. Crime story readers want to feel the intrigue of solving a puzzle along with, or just before, the protagonist, and they tend to enjoy the sense of security in seeing justice prevail. Crime's essential premise, its primary underlying idea, is that criminal activity results in chaos, whereas the pursuit of justice restores social order. Again, we see the primary story event as criminal activity. We see the big story change at the climax, which is restored social order, and we see the cause of the change as the pursuit of justice. Some crime stories set in science fiction worlds include 6 Weeks by Mur Lafferty. Modeled on the classic closed-room murder mystery, this novel takes place on a generation ship in deep space, where crew members are cloned as they age and die. The protagonist awakens from deep cryogenic sleep 25 years into the voyage to discover her last clone and the clones of the rest of the crew have been murdered. The culprit could be any one of them, including the protagonist herself. Lock-In by John Scalzi is a police procedural set in a near-future world where an epidemic has left 1% of its victims locked in, trapped fully conscious in unmoving, unsensing bodies. Some can afford robot-like vehicles they can transfer their consciousness into, and one such person is the protagonist, a federal agent assigned to solve a murder involving the misuse of the same technology. And Dark Run by Mike Brooks, set in a corrupt galaxy where life is cheap and criminals are the best people in it. This epic space heist has a crew of thieves and con artists who take on a dangerous secret job that could pay off a lot of debts if they survive. The third story type is horror. Horror stories exist to remind us that evil is never really destroyed, but the courage and eternal vigilance of ordinary people can keep it at bay. Horror stories are plot-driven, with a monster intent on destruction and a protagonist who becomes a victim. The monster can be anything: a human sociopath, an animal, an alien, a supernatural being, any being or force that does evil as part of its basic nature and can't be reasoned with. The protagonist is motivated by staying alive and avoiding a fate worse than death, such as torture. That means that the stakes in a horror story involve life, death, escape, and torment. The horror protagonist generally changes along a continuum from safety to danger to the threat of torment to escape. The horror reader wants to feel terror and imagine their bravery in facing a monster. Horror's essential premise is that ordinary people can keep evil at bay with courage and vigilance, whereas cowardice and indifference allow the monster to win and for evil to thrive. We see a primary story event, evil. We see the big story change at the climax, evil is kept at bay. And we see the cause of the change, the courage and vigilance of ordinary people. Horror almost always has an inherent speculative element, and its monsters can be aliens or technology, including biological entities like diseases. Some examples: Jordan Peele's film Get Out puts a young Black man into the country home of his white girlfriend's parents, where a secret technology is doing horrible things to other Black people and is coming for him next. Note that there's a secondary monster of racism operating in this story as well. Salvation Day by Kali Wallace gives us an abandoned exploration ship whose entire crew has been killed by a virus. Now, a motley band of space wanderers wants to take the ship and make it their own. They don't know that what's sleeping alongside the orbiting dead is a deadly secret that threatens all of humanity until they wake it up. And the classic science fiction film Alien, a near perfect model of a horror story where an alien monster picks off its victims one by one in a mining vessel far out in space. Now for a change of pace, the love story. Here's a chance for us to debunk a misconception, because it turns out that the love story isn't limited to the romance novel or rom-com. Love stories, overall, show us how to earn the intimacy, love, and togetherness that are essential to human thriving. Love stories are both plot-driven and character-driven and involve relationships of intimacy, vulnerability, and commitment, including friendship and family love, as well as romantic love. The love protagonist is motivated by a desire to win love or avoid vulnerability. The love protagonist risks rejection and vulnerability in order to gain intimacy and togetherness. The love protagonist usually changes along a continuum from disconnection and loneliness to connection and togetherness, but a less happy love story can go the other way. The love reader wants to feel anticipation of intimacy and vulnerability without the risk. Romantic and sexual anticipation may be at play in stories involving romantic love. The essential premise of the love story is that a willingness to be vulnerable leads to love, whereas an unwillingness to be vulnerable results in the loss of love and probable loneliness. The primary story event, desire for connection. We see the big story change at the climax, gaining or losing love, and the cause of that change, risking vulnerability or failing to. Love and science fiction make an unusual pairing, but let's look at some examples. The Time Traveler's Wife by Audrey Niffenegger is a love story about a man with a genetic disorder that causes him to time travel unpredictably, while Claire, an artist and his loving wife, has known him across time and must cope with his frequent disappearances into the time stream. Charlie Kaufman's film Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind posits the existence of a technology that erases the memories of failed relationships and helps the bereaved and the rejected overcome their trauma and loss. It tells the story of two lovers who get back together again even after this erasure. In Sean David Hutchinson's A Complicated Love Story Set in Space, three young people find themselves aboard a spaceship with no idea how they got there. They face aliens and disruptive memory technologies, while two of them are falling in love. The novel has a telling tagline: "Love is complicated enough without also trying to stay alive," letting us know that it's as much an action story as a love story. The fifth story type is worldview. The cultural purpose of a worldview story, broadly speaking, is to show that the world is not a simple black and white place. They teach us about accepting the nuance and complexity of other people and ourselves. Often referred to as a maturation or coming of age story, the worldview story is character-driven and involves a protagonist confronting their naivete, experiencing disillusionment, or finding meaning. The worldview protagonist's primary motivation is a desire to either gain knowledge or avoid some unpleasant truth, whether they're conscious of this desire or not. This means that the stakes for the worldview protagonist, what they have to gain or lose, what they have to lose mainly, are their ignorance or their cherished beliefs, while what they have to gain are knowledge and wisdom. The worldview protagonist arc of change is from ignorance to knowledge or wisdom. They tend to move from seeing the world in shades of black and white to understanding their role in a world of grays. Basically, they grow up. The reader chooses or enjoys a worldview story because they want to feel empathetic satisfaction or pity. They may also enjoy feeling comparatively wise and mature. The essential premise of the worldview story is that open-mindedness in the face of new information leads to wisdom, whereas avoiding the truth results in self-deception. So we see a primary story event, new information. We see the big story change at the climax, wisdom, or alternatively, self-deception. And we see the cause of that change, open-mindedness, or else avoiding the truth. You will find a worldview arc in almost any story involving a young adult protagonist, but the story type goes beyond just coming of age or maturation. The worldview protagonist can be of any age. Here are some examples. The Nobodies by Alana Schubach tells of two best friends who discover that by putting their foreheads together, they can swap bodies. As their worlds begin to mesh, each deceives the other, confesses, and is forgiven, but they each have to contend with the disappearing boundaries between them and the question of their own identities. As a story of strong female friendship, we might see The Nobodies as having a secondary love story of the intimate friendship variety. Ray Bradbury's classic, the haunting short story, All Summer in a Day, is set in a colony on Venus where it never stops raining except for 1 hour every 7 years. The child protagonist is from Earth, and unlike her new classmates, she has seen the sun before, talks about it a lot, and is longing to see it again. As the special hour approaches, jealous classroom bullies lock her in a closet and forget about her. When they let her out, the sun has come and gone, and she is left in the loss and grief to consider human nature. The Ones Who Walk Away from Omelas is a 1973 short story by Ursula K. Le Guin, set in a utopian city called Omelas, whose prosperity depends on the perpetual misery of a single child. When citizens learn this fact, most eventually acquiesce, but a few walk away. Nobody in Omelas, including the narrator, knows where they go, but they never come back. Typical of many short stories, science fiction or otherwise, this one and the previous example create a worldview shift in the reader as much as in the protagonist. Now for validation. This is the sixth story type and one that confuses a lot of writers. We read, watch, and write validation stories to examine our personal and cultural definitions of success and failure, and to remind ourselves that honorable values are more important than worldly success. Validation stories are character-driven and involve the protagonist's search for success and esteem. The validation protagonist is motivated by a desire for success, honor, and validation by others. For example, winning the trophy, triumphing in a competition, or moving higher in social ranking or wealth. Validation stakes, what the protagonist has to gain and what they have to lose, involve success, failure, and the selling out of true values. So the validation protagonist changes most along the spectrum of success, compromise, failure, and selling out or dishonor. They may start out successful and fall, or start out low and rise. The validation reader wants to feel admiration or pity and enjoy a sense of moral superiority. The essential premise of the validation story is that ethical choices create honorable success, whereas unworthy goals lead to selling out one's true values. The primary story event here is that, at least implied, some opportunities to rise. We see the big story change at the climax, honorable success or selling out, and we see the cause of that change, ethical choices or unethical ones. A validation story in a science fiction milieu isn't the most common combination, which might point to a good area for innovation. Here are some examples we were able to find. Terry Pratchett's novels are not absolutely classifiable as either science fiction or fantasy, but they do fall in the broad realm of speculative fiction, and they're a delight. In Going Postal, a convicted con artist is given a choice to run the moribund postal service in the capital city of Discworld instead of being hanged. It's a hopeless task, but he becomes committed to success by bringing the institution back to life. His adventures in uncovering a criminal conspiracy at the same time give this validation story a strong secondary crime story type. John Pepper's Green Goddess gives us the high-powered CEO of a fossil fuel energy company in the near future who must at least fake believing in the environmental movement in order to keep the corporation going. She eventually finds a way to fund research into fusion energy as an innovative answer to climate change. Matt Haig's The Midnight Library is also arguably more fantasy than science fiction, depending on whether you think the mechanism for the plot is weird science or outright magic. A young woman dissatisfied with her choices in life attempts suicide and finds herself between life and death in a library that contains the stories of all the alternate lives she might have lived. She visits them one by one, from an unhappy marriage to wild success as a rock star. She ultimately re-enters life with a new definition of what comprises a good life. Our seventh and final story type is redemption. Redemption stories are harder to find these days than in the past, but we have tended to tell them as a reminder that our wrongs can be forgiven if we take altruistic actions and sacrifice for the greater good. Redemption stories are character-driven and involve forgiveness or atonement. The redemption protagonist is motivated from the outset by guilt, shame, and a desire for forgiveness. The redemption protagonist risks not being forgiven and has to make sacrifices, but stands to gain atonement, forgiveness, and reconnection. They must make an active choice between selfishness and altruism. If they choose selfishness, they lose. And if they choose altruism, they win, but must sacrifice something important to them. The redemption protagonist almost always begins as a despicable character. knowingly doing or having done wrong, and changes for the better through altruistic sacrifice and difficult lessons. Alternately, they may begin hoping for redemption, but end having failed to attain it through incurable character weakness. The redemption reader wants to feel satisfaction, pity, contempt, or moral superiority if the character makes poor choices and fails. The essential premise of a redemption story type is altruistic action results in redemption, whereas selfishness leads to moral failure. In other words, redemption results when the protagonist atones for past wrongdoing by abandoning selfish goals and sacrificing for the greater good. Usually, the primary story event is the opportunity to make amends. The big story change at the climax is redemption or else moral failure. And the cause of the change is altruistic action and sacrifice, or selfish action. True redemption story in a true science fiction setting was a little hard to find, and we really only came up with one novel, an old one. And this one could be a real opportunity for innovation. Lots of room here. Gateway by Frederik Pohl begins in high action with a hero who is willing to sacrifice his life in a suicide mission to a black hole in order to let a large group of people live. But in the unstable event, his ship survives and the others don't. His survivor's guilt drives the rest of the story, and he seeks atonement, which is never truly possible for him. Of course, characters all over superhero and science fiction stories have individual redemption arcs, even though the stories are primarily action. In the Marvel Cinematic Universe, Natasha Romanoff is driven in part by her need to atone for wrongs she's done as a spy, saying, "There's red in my ledger." George Lucas has said that the 6 original Star Wars films were about the rise, fall, and redemption of Anakin Skywalker. Most of us would have a hard time overlooking his heinous atrocities, but as the story is presented, he shows regret and experiences release at death when his son Luke recognizes him. And there you have them, the 7 story types. There's so much to learn about combining story types, and at Pages and Platforms, we've developed a whole 20-module course on the subject. But the short version is that you need to weave a plot-driven story type with a character-driven story type to deliver a story that will truly engage your reader. Either choose a plot-driven primary story supported by a character-driven secondary arc, or choose a character-driven primary story where a plot-driven story type presents the external challenges your protagonist needs in order to change. Why? Because even the most heroic action protagonist undergoes some internal change. And even the quietest and most introverted of protagonists has to face troubles from the outside world. As a reminder, the plot-driven story types are action, crime, horror, and love, while the character-driven story types are worldview, validation, and redemption. You may have noticed that in several of our examples, I mentioned a secondary or supporting story type. For instance, Love with Action was a complicated love story set in space. Action with Redemption was Gateway. Validation with Crime, Going Postal. Worldview with Love, The Nobodies. Action with Worldview, The Parable of the Sower. A good way to innovate on your science fiction story is to try unexpected combinations of plot-driven and character-driven story types, or a combination that you find most personally evocative. And a quick recap before we move on to part 4. We've identified the 7 story types, and for each one, we've covered 5 essential story elements: the wants and needs, the basic motivation the protagonist of each story type must have, what's inherently at stake for the protagonist, that is, what they have to gain and what they risk losing as they go after what they want, the arc of change, that is, how the protagonist's state fundamentally changes from the beginning of the story to the end, the kind of emotions the reader of the story type hopes to feel, and the essential premise or message of the story type. Understanding these 5 elements helps you, the author, meet the expectations of your intended reader. Write a consistent story with a clear beginning, middle, and end, and finish your story. Now, back to Anne.
Well, thank you, Rochelle. We're going to hasten through the last part here. What about that subject that's so near and dear to the hearts of so many science fiction writers? World building. It feels like a huge subject, and it comes up a lot in our editing clients who are writing science fiction or fantasy. So we decided to boil it down to a few simple points. We find that there are 3 main questions any author of any kind of story needs to consider about the world in which their story is going to be set. Whether that's the most ordinary street in the most ordinary town in the present day, or on a planet orbiting a pair of binary stars at the edge of the galaxy. And those questions are, what obstacles and opportunities does the world present to the characters in your story? What is your narrative device and point of view? How much does your reader need to know in order to keep reading? Under the broad category of obstacles and opportunities, we include all the things most of us think of first as world building: climate and geography, the socioeconomic system, the culture, including material culture, and the history that underlies the story's present, and the state of science and technology. Even if you are not writing science fiction, you probably want to reckon with these 3 elements of whatever world your story is set in. Life on a space station, is it above a beautiful blue planet? Is it a good place to live? Or is it a limiting environment that your protagonist wants to get away from? Conversely, a squalid dystopian slum might seem like a terrible obstacle, something a protagonist would want to escape. But what if it's an opportunity because the most interesting and subversive people all live there? Is there a class system in your future alternate world? What is it based on? Can your character move up or fall down in the social order? Do they want to? And how about food? Is fresh food a rare commodity? Does everyone just swallow a nutrition pill? What are the constraints of communication? If your characters can communicate telepathically, for example, how does it work? What about regular messages? Does the speed of light create a significant barrier? Can just anyone afford to send messages? How do people in your world get around? Robot flying cars? Wormholes? What's the gravity like? In every instance, if your characters go places, important story constraints will include how they go, how much it costs in time and energy and maybe money, and the obstacles and opportunities posed by the geography or spaceography. For example, a region full of pirates, a difficult planetary feature, an energy barrier in space, and so forth. If a journey from point A to point B is smooth and uneventful, you probably don't need to describe it, and the landscape or spacescape it covers probably isn't important to your story. Maybe you began with a world and a map, and that's great. By all means, flesh it out. Readers who like adventures in science fiction lands or faraway places in space usually like to refer to the map. Same is true of fantasy, by the way. But your map is not your story. The geography of your world is really only relevant to the degree to which it limits your characters' choices, raises the stakes, defines what they want and need, and supports your premise. Now, the second question after obstacles and opportunities presented by the physical realities of the world is, what's your narrative device and point of view? This means who's telling the story, to whom, why, and from what distance in space and time. For example, in The Martian, Mark Watney is keeping a log, partly to have a feeling of someone to talk to so he doesn't lose his mind, and partly to document his ordeal for posterity. His narrative is aimed primarily at his NASA team back home. For those reasons, he reveals tons of technical and personal information and explains his actions. He's an engineer and a scientist, and he details virtually everything he does. Your narrative device probably won't be as obvious as the Martians, but you need to have some idea of who your narrator is, why they're telling the story, to what audience, and from how far away in time. That will constrain how much of your science fiction world you should describe, explain, or simply drop hints about. For example, if your point of view character is entering a new world for the first time, everything is going to be strange. Everything is a potential danger. Everything is unknown. When Katniss first rolls into Panem on the fancy train in the Hunger Games, there's room in the first-person present tense narrative for the reader to experience quite a bit of detail through her eyes and her senses, but much of it can't be explained because Katniss herself doesn't yet understand what she's seeing. On the other hand, if your point of view character is in their everyday world, they will only notice what's different or out of place, and you, the author, have to select the details that would naturally occur to that point of view character and will help bring the reader along. Rick Deckard has always lived in the Los Angeles of Blade Runner, so in order for the audience to understand what's going on, the film uses the narrative device of a film noir voiceover, where Deckard seems to speak directly to the audience and explain things. The film has often been criticized for this device, so if you use it with caution. We've all absorbed thousands of stories, and increasingly most of them are via video. Filmmakers add a vast amount of world-building detail in every shot. As novelists, however, if we try to do that in words on the page, that's what I call the movie mistake. Let me give you an example. Here's a screenshot of a marketplace in Wakanda in Ryan Coogler's film Black Panther. Prince T'Challa, may he rest in peace, is out walking in Wakanda with his lady friend, Nakia. It's hot. It's dusty. There's a smell of spices in the air. Handmade baskets hang from pegs outside a shop. Plants grow up the sides of the buildings everywhere. The architecture is a jumble of exuberant shapes and forms, colored patterns, black and white stripes, and the streetlights are hoops of vibranium. Buildings rise right up a steep, lush green hill, taking advantage of every available space in this crowded, vibrant city. A streetcar with ovoid windows and copper trim makes its leisurely way along the narrow street, and the brightly dressed people stroll out of its way. Are you bored yet? Would you like me to get on with the story? I don't know. I don't know your reader. I don't know you as a writer specifically. The point is, some readers like a good bit of description and scene setting in order to feel grounded in the story, and some have little patience for it at all. So the question is, what do you like? Write that. Test it with beta readers, sure. Be prepared to modify it based on feedback. But no reader is ever going to picture the scene exactly as you do anyway. So all you can do is provide the 2 or 3 or maybe 4 or 5 details that drive the story forward while helping the reader enter the spirit of the setting and form their own impressions. But don't leave the reader in an empty room or a vague outdoor space either. You may have a vivid picture in your mind of everything in the scene and forget to share it with the reader. I do that all the time. Alternatively, you may be aphantasic, someone who doesn't actually have visual images in your mind to begin with. Either way, it's important to select or think up a few details to include on the page. For instance, what's out the window? How do people in this space get around? Can you reveal character with a detail like decoration? A hint of the comfort or Spartanness of the space, or some other detail that could reveal the nature of the character who lives there. Be selective and precise in these choices, and most readers will feel that they're experiencing the full setting. To wrap up this world-building discussion, we've got 3 pretty good rules of thumb for how much to include on the page. First, less is usually more. If you show us a ship emerging from a wormhole into the region of a beautiful home planet, how much do we need to know about the mechanics of the wormhole? Maybe a little, maybe nothing. Depends on what the role the wormhole is going to play in your story. If you show us a shanty in a dystopian future favela on the edges of San Francisco, do we need to know how many windows it has? Only if your character is going to escape that way. Second, if the reader genuinely needs to understand an aspect of your world in order to stay with the story, prefer description over explanation, and try not to interrupt action with either description or explanation. Remember that dialogue is a form of action too. So show us a character using a technology rather than telling us the history of that technology. Show your protagonist flying around in a derelict freighter in space. And even if you know the whole story of the freighter and how it got there, and that history is really cool, think hard about how much of it the reader needs to know. Select details that will pay off later. For example, if you're going to have a character's community wiped out by a meteor in the third act, you probably need to introduce the meteor in the first act. Okay, this has been a lot to absorb. Let's quickly recap what we've covered. Today, you've learned the 5 essential elements that every story needs. You've learned why the science fiction genre does not determine what kind of story you're telling. You've learned the 7 story types and their importance to science fiction writers and all fiction writers. You've learned how story type can help you meet all your readers' expectations and how you can use the story types to innovate in the science fiction realm. And you've got a distilled philosophy of world building. And we hope you're ready to go to work on your science fiction story. Before we go to the Q&A, we'd love to remind you to stop by pagesandplatforms.com/sci-fi for our free written guide to the 7 essential story types. And now let's go to your questions. Ooh, I
All
see we got a
right,
bunch
so
of them
just a
there.
reminder that questions go into the Q&A box. I've pulled a couple out of the chat, but if you've put something in the chat and you still want the question answered, go ahead and put it in the Q&A, and we don't have much time. So Jack Ryan asked, is it possible to include all 7 story types in one story? And I'll answer that quickly. Yes, it's possible to do anything you want, but it probably won't be a story. It'll probably be a bunch of things that happen. So if you are writing a story, our suggestion is generally not to combine more than 3. 4 is pushing it. So, try to narrow it down as much as you can. The idea is to have a primary story, a primary want for a single protagonist. Even if you have an ensemble list of characters, couples as primary, you still have one primary protagonist, and their story, their struggle should be the primary heaviness of the story. Jim asks, what would you say is the difference between science fiction and speculative fiction?
I do not have a scholarly answer for that question. I think of it, science fiction, as being the science is the key word. You want technology, there's machinery, there's robots, or whatever medical, biological technology, that sort of thing. Whereas speculative can include things like we mentioned Matt Haig's The Midnight Library, where it's not quite fantasy, but it's definitely not in the realm of the ordinary everyday material reality. That would be a very loose definition, and I've looked around and I don't find anything more specific than that. It's kind of like, when you see it, that
I think of it as
how I think of it.
All science fiction is likely speculative fiction, but not all speculative fiction is science oriented. What if these scientific things happened? So, and then you'll get 10 answers if you ask 10 different people. Anonymous says, any thoughts on sci-fi connected with horror mystery genre, close to Resident Evil style? I'm going to skip that because I don't necessarily think that's a question. And we got a lot coming in here. Neosi, I hope I pronounced that correctly. I heard story fiction was a genre of hard scientific facts like Star Trek. That's why they put Star Wars into science fantasy, because they don't focus much on the science, but the fantasy of the magic. It's called the Force, until the prequels were written and they tried to explain the Force.
That's actually a pretty good example of the difference between science fiction and sort of science fantasy or fantasy, is when they got those midichlorians in and they had to have a material world explanation for the magic of the story. That's a really good example. Until they introduced midichlorians, it was magic, and then it became science.
An anonymous attendee says, from editor and author point of view, what do you think about stories set up in the same time? For example, first book follows 2 main characters, but there is a complementary book that explains other things that main characters do not see in the first book.
Sure. I mean, you're talking about Bill. There's not that much difference between something like that and, let's say, Jessica Fletcher in Cabot Cove, where you have a setting and you tell different stories in that world, in that setting. I don't know if we can be more specific than your question, but
well,
what do I think about it? Yeah, it's a great idea. Why not?
What I want to say about that is I love that idea, different stories of the same world, taking secondary characters and then making their story. I want to flag one thing here, though. The question was, what do you think about another book that explains, keyword explains, the main character, what the main characters don't see in the first book. So
we want it to be shown, not explained.
right. So
we want stories about it.
Right. If you find yourself thinking, I need to explain, I want to explain, quote, the reader needs to know, take a deep breath and ask yourself, how can I show this instead of explain it? Because explaining something is not story. Boris asks, are the story types the same as the 7 basic plots of Mr. Booker? Absolutely not. Booker's 700-page chunk of a book, definitely worth reading if you're into that sort of thing. But no, his things are like drama, comedy. They're entirely different. Those 7 basic plots, I didn't find very helpful, but our brains all think in different ways. So if you're into plots and story arcs and that sort of thing, and really differentiating one from the other because you're not set on using one or the other, go ahead and check that out. It might appeal to you.
R.M. Archer asks, can your book contain different story types for each primary character's arc? I would first say you better have one primary character and everybody else is at least a little bit secondary to that. That said, let's say in a typical love story, you have a primary character and then you have the love interest, and they almost are like 51% of the story. And the answer is yes. The secondary character can be going through a different internal arc from the primary character. One needs to have a redemption and the other needs to lighten up, or something like that. That I'm talking in romance terms here, but yes, you can do that.
Andrew Hyman asks, how would you characterize a military sci-fi story that is full of action and adventure? However, the protagonist, initially bent on revenge against the enemy, doesn't get what they need until they reject being a soldier and embrace love.
Sounds a little redemption-y to me.
I'm going to say, when I get this kind of question, it's usually validation. He's set on being a soldier and what a soldier means to him and his external status and that sort of thing. And I'm going to succeed as a soldier, but he realizes that his true values lie elsewhere, and being a soldier doesn't express his true values. So I'm going to say, look at a combination. Revenge would be action. So I'm going to say, check out the combination of action and validation and see if that fits for you.
Anonymous asks, how do you self-publish a book if your story has many elements? Yeah, that's a really big question. And so sci-fi, but also mystery, action. Go ahead, Rochelle. This is a really large question.
Oh, well, I'll make it short and sweet. Sci-fi, but also mystery, action, and there's a faint hope of romance, but not the main plot. Romance here can be the little black dress of the story. Yes, it's set in a sci-fi world, and it's a mystery action story. Done. You've got a mystery. I would probably market it as mystery, sci-fi mystery. That's probably
what do you put on the back cover to sell it? What's your blurb? What does your blurb say?
And I'd ask, what are the main stakes? Is it more towards crime for mystery, or is it more towards action? And that's what you're going to play up in your back cover blurb.
I'm going to pass Marilyn because we answered that one already. Okay. The more than one story type. Neosi says, you say that a love story is a story-driven story. We say that it's both plot and character-driven. It's actually what we say. But if you want to create an action-driven story and the characters must create a good relationship to work together to defeat the antagonist, is that an action plus a love story? Sure, there's such a thing as like romantic thrillers and that type of story where the two characters in their relationship has to work in order for them to accomplish the larger external goal of saving lives, solving the crime, those types of combinations.
All right, we are running out of time here, so I'm going to say let's do one last question. And will we receive the resource on the 7 story types if we sign up for the newsletter on the site, or is it something
Yes.
separate? You sign up,
Yes.
you'll get
You
that.
get the newsletter. Yeah. And let's see, I'm just scrolling through. We got a lot of questions. Thank you for your enthusiastic interest here. Would the character self-actualization stories? Would character self-actualization stories be considered probably worldview as typical? But there's you've given Wizard of Oz, Eat, Pray, Love, some really widely varying examples there. Either worldview or validation is typically self-actualization. Either they self-actualize through gaining success or facing failure, or they self-actualize through accepting a truth or having something revealed to them.
All right. Well, thank you all for coming. Michelle, do you have any closing things to say?
Just thank you so much, Rochelle and Anne. That was great. We received so much great feedback on the presentation already, and it's always a pleasure to have you both here with us for our event. So thank you again for being here.
Thank you,
All right,
and thanks
thank you so
everybody.
much.
Bye, everybody. See you next time.
Bye.